The purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to concepts of ethnicity and nationalism and the role they play within our explanations in political science. So let's start off with some basic questions. What is a nation? A nation, simply put, is an ethnic group that demands a state. Now, ethnic groups all over the world frequently demand some kind of autonomy or some kind of recognition within the states in which they reside. But nations go a step further and desire a state for themselves. So why does it matter to anyone whether people of the same ethnic group share a state and are dominant within a state? And I don't think there's any easy, obvious answers here, but here are some considerations or some things to think about. Maybe it's the case that the social solidarity and trust that comes with sharing a national identity with others is necessary or at least conducive to facilitating the provision of public goods on a large scale. Scale matters because large states compete more effectively on the international stage. They have more troops and a bigger economy, and a big economy with a lot of social solidarity is one that's going to work a little bit better. Two considerations here. One, trust is necessary to make markets work better. Trade works better if people aren't investing too many resources in making sure that the other side keeps to their bargains. And public goods aren't overused, and taxes are generally paid when people feel like they're going to causes that they identify with. And if they identify with people of the same ethnicity or the same nationality, then they'll be more likely to pay their taxes and behave in a socially responsible way. The argument is that if they don't, they're more likely to behave in less pro-social ways, and so it'll be more expensive to run a state. Now, it's not entirely clear, particularly to cosmopolitans, why it is one should trust or care about strangers who share a language and a culture with us more than strangers who don't share a language with a culture with us. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that communication and cooperation are probably facilitated by sharing these things, and that makes getting common projects or even private projects done a lot easier. So maybe political life needs to be focused around some common elements, and in this era of history, nationality isn't that element. In prior eras, you could imagine that kinship groups, that is to say family status, or feudal ties, or religion provided the social glue a common life could be built around, a common political life could be built around. But times have changed, and now perhaps nationality is that glue. Now, nationalism appears really as a self-conscious movement in the 19th century, and it spreads quickly as a challenge to multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, confessional here means religious, right? So empires with lots of ethnicities and lots of religions, and nationalism is a challenge to these. Think of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire. All of these large empires in the 19th century rule over people from very different religions, very different languages, very different backgrounds and cultures. And arguably nationalism contributes to the breakup of all of these empires. Now, does nationalism spread because people just started to feel solidarity with one another, or did it spread because local elites found it helpful to persuade people that they shared something in common in order to fulfill sort of their selfish quests to wrest power and resources away from other elites? In other words, is nationalism a pretext, something that essentially serves as a justification for some elites to try to wrest control from other elites? Or is it something that appears more organically, something that people ultimately created from the ground up, and that really does tie people together in real solidarity? And that's basically the debate between two schools of thought on ethnic conflict, instrumentalism and constructivism. So let's talk about these two in turn. Instrumentalism first. Instrumentalism says that rational and self-interested elites manipulate shared symbols, it should be a D there, shared symbols and feelings to mobilize people towards political goals. In other words, it's a tool. It's a way of basically pulling one over people in general. So on this view, nations are basically constructs elites have invented in order to more effectively wage war, tax, or rule society, right? So by convincing people that they share a nationality, it makes it easier to raise troops for conflicts that only really elites benefit from. It makes it easier to tax people, to fund, certainly shared social programs, but perhaps also fund the bank accounts of those who manage those taxes, and to rule society more effectively in general. That is to say, obey the rules. It would be unpatriotic not to. So it's easier to conscript people, it's easier to raise taxes if people believe that the money and the troops are going to a cause that they believe in. And so nationalism in that sense is extraordinarily convenient. Constructivism takes a different view. On this view, identities are engage in an ongoing process of social construction. That is to say, people's identities are always malleable and subject to manipulation. But unlike with instrumentalism, the definition of one's identity is not a one-way street where the elites basically serve identities to the people. The social construction of identity is much more give and take. Elites manipulate fraternal feelings for sure, and commercial classes perhaps may also encourage these feelings to, say, buy local rather than buying from a foreigner. But of course the masses also encourage these feelings in order to perhaps extract pensions and poverty relief and political conceptions from the other classes in society. And so all classes in society find ways to manipulate identity in order to try and serve their individual interests. So, sorry, I didn't mean to include this slide. Let's just delete that. So, the nation, at the end of the day, might also be a solution to a problem within democracy. Democracy says that, in some fashion, the people ought to rule. But which people ought to rule? Over whom? Right? Who are these people who are supposed to self-govern? Defining the boundaries of who it is exactly who should be involved in this process of self-governance, the demos, or the political community, is called the boundary problem in the field of democratic theory. Nationalism settles the problem by providing some account of who the political community is and is not. However, there are competing accounts about how to solve this boundary problem, right? So utilitarians might say, no, it's not national status that ought to determine who gets to vote and who gets citizenship rights, but it's simply a way of trying to internalize positive and negative externalities, right? So it's a way to ultimately provide public goods. Cosmopolitans might see democracy merely as a convenient unit for administering justice. So there's nothing really deep about who we are as a people, but it just happens to be the case that if countries get too large or too diverse, justice will be less well served. And so in that sense, it's instrumentally useful to have arbitrary boundaries and leave it at that, because it's just better off for everyone else, or for everyone, if we carve up the world this way. Now, typically nationalists advocate hard borders. This means that crossing from one political community to the next is a big deal. Unlike, say, crossing from Tennessee into Kentucky, where the rules change, but not a lot, and quite frankly, most of us may not notice very much changing when we switch from Tennessee to Kentucky. The border between Tennessee and Kentucky is basically a soft border. The border, of course, between the U.S. and Canada, or the U.S. and Mexico, is much more of a hard border. Now, trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the WTO, the World Trade Organization, soften borders a little bit by making it easier for goods and people and services to pass from one jurisdiction to another. While, on the other hand, the process of making it difficult to get travel visas and those difficult immigration procedures at the borders make, ultimately, borders harder. Right, so you have hard borders are borders that are difficult to cross. Soft borders are borders that are easy to cross, even though things do change on one side of the border to the other. Now, hard border nationalists tend to come in two flavors. They're civic nationalists, and civic nationalists are usually those in states that predate the national sentiment that unites the state. So, that is to say, the state existed before national consciousness existed. So if you think about France or the United States or Turkey. These were political units long before there were people who understood themselves as French, American, or Turkish. Right, so in the early colonial period, people might have been Virginians or Tennesseans or New Yorkers, but they didn't quite see themselves completely as Americans. Similarly, France was certainly a political unit long before there were any French people in it. Civic nationalism is associated with the idea of assimilationalism, which we'll talk about in a bit, and the idea of the right of the soil, jus solis, which we'll talk about in a bit. Civic nationalism is opposed to cultural nationalism, where usually cultural nationalism exists where the national sentiment predates the state. That is to say, there were people who called themselves Germans before there was a political Germany, right? So there were people who called themselves Germans, even though Germany was what was today Germany was divided into Prussia and Bavaria and Austria-Hungary and Saxony and many other states that sort of skip my mind right now. But the point is that this kind of nationalism is much more cultural, and it's exclusionary and follows the right of blood, jus sanguinis, where citizenship rights are passed on through descent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, in civic nationalism, the nation is defined by a shared set of political commitments. Anyone who shares that commitment and lives in the right place can call themselves a citizen. This view tends to be quite friendly to immigrants. As long as they adopt the civic values of the state they have moved to, they can call themselves a citizen. Right? So this view is associated with the idea that immigrants ought to be assimilated. They ought to become like the people who live there, and as long as they adopt the right values, it doesn't really matter within some limits what their religion is, what their skin color is, or even necessarily how well they speak the language. So an example of assimilationism is in France, where laws have been passed to prevent Muslim women from wearing their traditional headscarves in schools or in courtrooms because the state has decided that as a religious symbol, these veils and headscarves are not compatible with secular French civic values. The attitude the French state takes is essentially that these headscarves are there to diminish women, to denigrate their civic and political status, and so in the Muslim religion, and this is something that the French state wants to combat. This view is particularly associated with the idea of the jus solis tradition, which is the right of the soil. You're part of a nation because essentially you live and interact within a geographically bound community. As long as you're a member of that community, adopt the values and attitudes of the community, you can be a citizen, and that's what defines your citizenship rights. The flip side of this is cultural nationalism, where the nation is defined by a common ethnic or cultural characteristic, and only people who have this characteristic can be part of the nation. This view tends to be much more exclusionary towards immigrants who have not grown up as members of the nation, that is to say, they have not inherited the specific cultural characteristics of the nation. So, immigrants may certainly reside in the geographic space occupied by the nation, but they do not and perhaps cannot become members even after a long spell of residence. They exist on the territory as guests and on the sufferance of members, and they will never be members. They'll never be members because their status derives ultimately from their blood, their genetic descendants. So this view is associated with jus sanguinis, which means the right of the blood in Latin. You're part of the nation only because you're descended from members and grew up as a member of the nation. And this is very much the attitude that many Germans take. It's also the attitude that the Japanese take, I believe the Swiss, and back in ancient times, that was the Athenian tradition. You couldn't be Athenian unless both your parents were also Athenian, which tended to make Athenian citizenship a very exclusive club. So, we said that nationalism of either kind, civic or cultural, could help facilitate political projects that contribute to the welfare of its members by decreasing the cost of providing certain goods, certain public goods, like We said trust, we said taxes, we said common defense, and things like that. Of course, nationalism also leads to some of the darkest episodes in human history, and let me give you two examples of nationalism gone awry. Think of, and one of this is civic nationalism, and the other one is cultural nationalism. So in the civic nationalism case, think of the stolen children of Aboriginal Australia. These were Aboriginal children who were born to the Aboriginal population of Australia and who basically were taken away from their parents and placed with white families. This was an assimilationist policy to try and assimilate the Aborigines to Australian culture, essentially by taking Aboriginal children away from their parents and their culture and placing them in the middle of white Australian culture. And on the view of the assimilationists, this was an attempt to rescue the children from their parents' quote-unquote primitive culture and bring them in so that they could be equals within the nation, rather than a subject people within an empire. Of course, the children and the parents tended not to see it in this way, and indeed history has frowned really badly on this practice of this attempt to assimilate. And indeed, I think these Aboriginal children are often called the lost generation. And indeed, the Aboriginal culture has suffered and declined significantly in Australia as a result of that policy. The other example is of a more probably more familiar to you, and these are the German Jews, who had grown up and completely assimilated to German culture in most or all ways. But when Adolf Hitler came to power, they were declared a cancer on the nation, something to be excised and eliminated. Many ethnic Jews whose families had converted to Christianity generations ago, intermarried with German Christians, were still sent to the camps to die, regardless of how German they felt and regardless of how German they were culturally. So it didn't really matter that they had assimilated, because what made them Jewish was Jewish blood and Jewish ancestry, not their cultural convictions or cultural attitudes. And so being German at the time was a question of one's ethnic heritage, not one's acquired cultural characteristics, and of course this led to the death camps. What we can say here is that, and Germany, by the way, has not changed its stance very much on national identity. There are still significant minorities, Turkish minorities particularly, in Germany that do not have German citizenship. And although these things are reforming bit by bit, it's still the case, by and large, that it's much more difficult to get German citizenship than it is to get citizenship of lots of other countries. So, some questions that remain. Nationalism today remains in tension with multiculturalism and the celebration of diversity that's often become popular in many Western places today and popularized largely by American culture, which is the ultimate civic nationalist culture in a way. Now, a lot of people think that nationalism is outdated, and instead they embrace an ethic of universal equal respect, either for persons, those are cosmopolitans, or an equal respect for cultures, that's the cultural relativist view. Both of these views are actually quite distinct, but they're opposed to hard borders nationalism. They're much more inclusive in that sense. But there are other people who think that, sorry, something weird happened there. There are other people who think that trends towards inclusiveness and acceptance of diversity and multiculturalism have ultimately undermined the strength of Western states by making it more difficult or perhaps impossible for them to pursue common projects where social solidarity is necessary. It's made it much harder for people to feel like they're part of the same common project when there's so many differences between people. And this is kind of the view that is taken in the video that you have to watch on the disappearance of the German nation. People who are in Germany are worried that their nation is being undermined and their ability to carry out common projects and to keep the costs of those projects low is undermined by the large number of immigrants that are being accepted into German society. Although note that in a relative sense, the number of immigrants in the United States is much, much larger than that in Germany. Okay, so that's it for nationalism and ethnicity. I will see you for another video on ethnic conflict shortly.